Imagine this for a moment. It is the winter of 1645 in England. A cold mist hangs over the narrow village lanes. The last glow of daylight has long disappeared, and only a few candles flicker behind small wooden windows. The air is still, broken only by the distant hoot of an owl and the gentle rustling of bare branches in the wind. At the very edge of the village stands a tiny stone cottage. A woman lives there alone. Today, history barely remembers her name, but in her own time, almost everyone in the village knew who she was. Some claimed she wandered into the forest after sunset. Others whispered that she collected strange herbs beneath the moonlight. Mothers quietly brought their sick children to her door, hoping her remedies would succeed where prayers had failed. Yet when illness spread through the village, when a family's cow suddenly died, or when a harvest failed without warning, the same frightened voices always pointed toward the same lonely cottage. It must be her. Rumors travel much faster than truth. But here's the question that historians still ask today. Was she really a witch? Or was she simply a woman whose knowledge frightened people who could not understand it? Tonight, we travel back to one of the darkest chapters in English history, a time when fear often mattered more than evidence, and suspicion could become a death sentence. This is not a fairy tale. It is a story inspired by the very real witch trials that swept across England during the 17th century. So settle in, relax, and let history unfold. The year was 1645. England was already exhausted. The country was being torn apart by civil war. Food was scarce in many places. Disease spread quickly, and people searched desperately for explanations whenever tragedy struck. Without modern medicine or scientific knowledge, many believed that invisible forces shaped everyday life. If crops failed, someone had cursed them. If a child became sick overnight, someone must be responsible. Fear filled the empty spaces where understanding had not yet arrived. And in times like these, people often search for someone to blame. Very often, that someone was a woman. Many of the women accused of witchcraft were elderly widows. Some lived alone. Others worked as herbal healers or midwives. Many were poor. Some simply behaved differently from everyone else. Their independence made neighbors uncomfortable. Their knowledge made others suspicious. Their loneliness made them easy targets. One of the most infamous men of this period was Matthew Hopkins, who later became known as the Witch Finder General. Although he never officially held that title, he traveled across eastern England claiming to identify witches. Entire villages welcomed him. People believed he could protect them from evil. Instead, his investigations often spread even greater fear. Hundreds of women were questioned. Many were imprisoned. Some were executed. The evidence against them would seem unbelievable today. A strange birthmark, talking to a black cat, owning unusual herbs, speaking too confidently, or simply being disliked by neighbors. None of these proved anything. Yet in frightened communities, they were sometimes enough to destroy a person's life. Imagine living in such a world. Every conversation carried risk. Every unusual habit could become a rumor. Every rumor could become an accusation. And every accusation could end in court. For many women, silence became a form of survival. Historians now believe that countless accused women were not mysterious at all. Many simply understood traditional medicine. Long before pharmacies existed, villages depended upon people who knew which plants eased pain, reduced fever, or helped wounds heal. Knowledge passed quietly from one generation to another, but knowledge can become dangerous when society stops trusting it. As fear grew, healing herbs became magic. Experience became witchcraft. Wisdom became evidence. One neighbor's gratitude could quickly become another neighbor's suspicion. Some women who had once been respected suddenly found themselves isolated. Others were abandoned even by friends who feared being accused themselves. The saddest part is that many of these women left behind almost no written words of their own. History mostly remembers what was written about them, not what they themselves believed. Their voices were almost completely lost. Today, historians piece together fragments from old court records, parish documents, and letters. The picture they reveal is very different from the terrifying stories once told around village fires. Most of these women were ordinary people trying to survive extraordinary times. They cooked. They cared for children. They gathered herbs. They prayed. They worried about winter. They hoped for peaceful days, just like everyone else. Yet history transformed many of them into monsters they never were. It reminds us of something surprisingly timeless. When people are frightened, they often search for simple answers to complicated problems. Sometimes those answers point toward the innocent. Centuries have passed since those cold English winters. The forests remain. Many of the old stone churches still stand. The village paths are quieter now. Visitors walk through them without realizing the lives once changed there forever. If you ever find yourself wandering through the English countryside on a misty evening, you might pass an ancient cottage whose story has long been forgotten. It is worth remembering that behind many legends lies a real human life. Not every woman accused of witchcraft possessed mysterious powers. Many possess something far more ordinary: knowledge, compassion, experience, and the courage to be different in a world that feared difference. Perhaps that is the greatest lesson these forgotten women leave behind. History is not only written by kings, queens, and generals. Sometimes it is hidden within the quiet lives of ordinary people whose truth took centuries to be heard. And as the candle burns lower and the village slowly disappears into the night, one question remains: how many other forgotten women are still waiting for history to tell their real stories? As the winter of 1645 settled over England, the village awoke each morning beneath a blanket of frost. Before sunrise, smoke drifted gently from stone chimneys, and the narrow lanes echoed with the sound of wooden carts rolling over frozen ground. Life was never easy, but people carried on just as their parents and grandparents had done for generations. And every few days, someone would quietly knock on the door of the lonely cottage, not to accuse the woman. Not yet. They came because they needed her. A young mother carrying a feverish child, an elderly farmer with aching joints, a shepherd whose hands had become infected after weeks of hard work. The woman never claimed to perform miracles. She simply listened. She examined herbs she had gathered from nearby woods and fields. Some leaves were dried carefully above the fireplace. Others were mixed into warm teas or crushed into simple ointments. Everything she knew had been taught to her years earlier by her own mother, who had learned the same knowledge from her grandmother. It was not magic. It was tradition. Long before doctors were available to ordinary people, village healers filled an important role. Most families could never afford a trained physician. Even if they could, the nearest doctor might live many miles away. So women like her became the people everyone turned to in moments of fear and illness. Strangely, the very knowledge that made her valuable also made her dangerous. People trusted her when they were desperate. But once they recovered, some began asking uncomfortable questions. How did she know which herbs worked? Why did animals seem calm around her? Why did she spend so much time alone in the forest? In a world without science, mystery often filled the gaps left by understanding. One evening, as snow covered the fields outside the village, a young boy arrived at her cottage, carrying his little sister. The child had been burning with fever for nearly 2 days. The girl's mother was terrified. The woman quietly invited them inside. She placed fresh water over the fire. She mixed dried willow bark with a handful of other carefully chosen herbs. She wrapped the child in warm blankets and told the family to keep her comfortable through the night. Hours passed. By morning, the fever had begun to fall. To the family, it felt like a miracle. To the woman, it was simply hope, patience, and years of experience. Today, scientists know that willow bark contains salicin, a natural compound related to the ingredient that later inspired aspirin. But in 1645, no one understood chemistry. Many only saw something they could not explain. Stories spread quickly through the village. Some called her gifted. Others called her dangerous. The line between healer and witch was becoming thinner with every passing week. Then something happened that changed everything. A wealthy farmer lost 3 healthy cows within a single week. No one knew why. Soon afterward, another family's crops failed despite good weather. Then a newborn baby died unexpectedly. Each tragedy had a different cause. But frightened people wanted a single explanation. Whispers returned. The woman in the stone cottage. People stopped saying her name. It was easier to fear a stranger than to accept that life could sometimes be cruel without reason. The church sermons became darker. Neighbors watched one another more carefully. Children were told not to walk near the forest after sunset. Even those who had once thanked the woman for saving their loved ones now crossed the road rather than greet her. Fear has a remarkable way of rewriting memory. Acts of kindness were forgotten. Rumors became facts, and silence slowly replaced truth. The woman noticed a change. She saw curtains close as she walked past. She heard conversation stop when she entered the village. The baskets of fresh bread that neighbors once left at her door no longer appeared. Winter had become colder, not because of the snow, but because loneliness had settled over the village like the thick English fog. She had no idea that somewhere beyond her quiet little village, a man named Matthew Hopkins was already traveling across eastern England, and before long, their paths would cross. When they did, history would remember his name, but it would almost forget hers. The first sign was not the sound of horses. It was the silence. One cold morning in the early spring of 1645, the village seemed strangely quiet. Shopkeepers spoke in whispers. Children, who usually chased one another through the muddy lanes, stayed close to their parents. Even the church bells sounded heavier than usual. Then, just after sunrise, 3 riders appeared on a narrow road leading into the village. At the front rode a tall man dressed in dark clothing. His face showed little emotion, and his eyes moved slowly from house to house, as though he were searching for something only he could see. His name was Matthew Hopkins. Although he held no official government office, many people believed he had been chosen to uncover witches hiding across England for frightened villages. His arrival often brought a strange sense of relief. At last, they thought, someone would explain why so many terrible things had happened. The village elders welcomed him into the meeting hall. One by one, they described every misfortune they could remember: a failed harvest, a child who had died during winter, animals that had become sick without warning, an old woman who lived alone at the edge of the forest. As the stories continued, Hopkins listened quietly. He asked very few questions. Instead, he wrote names, and one name appeared more than any other: the woman from the stone cottage. She knew nothing about the meeting taking place in the center of the village. That afternoon, she was gathering rosemary, sage, and yarrow along the edge of the woodland. The air smelled of damp earth after several days of rain. Birds sang from the branches above. For a brief moment, the world felt peaceful again. She filled her basket and slowly made her way home. As she approached her cottage, she noticed something unusual. Footprints, many of them, fresh footprints, surrounded her front door. Someone had been there while she was away. Inside, nothing had been stolen, but everything had been disturbed. Drawers had been opened. Bundles of dried herbs had been scattered across the floor. Glass bottles lay broken beside the fireplace. Someone had searched every corner of her home. The next morning, there was another knock at her door. This time, it was not a frightened mother seeking medicine. It was 2 village guards. "We have been asked to bring you to the meeting hall," one of them said quietly. She looked at their faces. Neither man would meet her eyes. She knew something had changed. As she walked through the village, people stepped aside. Some stared. Others looked away. A few quietly closed their doors. The same neighbors who had once thanked her for easing their pain now watched her as if she were someone they had never known. Inside the meeting hall, Matthew Hopkins sat at a long wooden table. A single candle burned beside him. Sheets of handwritten notes covered the table. Without raising his voice, he asked simple questions. Where did you learn about herbs? Why do people visit your home at night? Why do you live alone? Every answer she gave seemed to create another question. When she explained that her mother had taught her about healing plants, some whispered that secret knowledge was often passed between witches. When she said people visited because they were sick, others claimed that illness itself proved her dark influence. No answer seemed capable of convincing those who had already decided what they wished to believe. This was the cruelest part of many witch trials. The accusation often came first. Evidence was expected to follow later. Sometimes it never came at all. By sunset, Hopkins closed his notebook. He spoke only a few words. She will remain under observation. It was not a sentence. Not yet, but for the woman, it was enough. She returned to her cottage under the watch of 2 guards. No one spoke during the walk home. The evening sky turned deep orange before fading into gray. Smoke rose quietly from the village chimneys. Life appeared perfectly ordinary. Yet for one woman, nothing would ever be ordinary again. That night, she sat alone beside the dying fire. Outside, the wind moved gently through the trees. Inside, she looked at the shelves where her herbs still rested. The same plants that had healed so many people were now being treated as proof of a terrible crime. And somewhere in the darkness beyond her window, the whispers had already begun again. The days that followed were the longest she had ever known. Every morning, 2 village guards escorted her from the small stone cottage to the meeting hall. Every evening, they walked her home again. She was not free, but she was not yet a prisoner. The village lived in a strange state of waiting. People gathered in small groups outside the church, speaking in quiet voices whenever she passed. Some avoided looking at her altogether. Others watched with open suspicion. It was as if the woman they had known for years had suddenly become a complete stranger. Matthew Hopkins continued his investigation. He asked the villagers the same question again and again. Has anyone witnessed anything unusual? At first, there was silence. Then one man stepped forward. He claimed he had seen a black cat sitting outside her cottage late one evening. Another woman said she had heard strange sounds coming from the forest. Someone else insisted that milk had turned sour the very day after visiting the healer. None of these stories proved anything, yet each new rumor made the next one easier to believe. Soon, people began remembering events that had never seemed important before. A neighbor recalled an argument from years earlier. A farmer remembered losing a sheep one harsh winter. A child claimed to have seen shadows moving near the cottage after dark. Fear has an unusual power. It allows ordinary memories to become extraordinary stories. Hopkins listened carefully. He wrote every statement into his notebook. The more pages he filled, the more convinced the villagers became that he was uncovering the truth. But writing something down does not make it true. One afternoon, the woman was asked to empty the pockets of her cloak. She quietly placed everything on the wooden table: a small knife used for cutting herbs, a piece of linen, a tiny cloth pouch filled with dried lavender. The room fell silent. Hopkins picked up the pouch. "What is this for?" he asked. She answered calmly, "It helps people sleep." Several villagers exchanged uneasy glances. Today, lavender is known around the world for its gentle fragrance and calming qualities. But in 17th century England, many people viewed unfamiliar remedies with suspicion. Something as ordinary as a dried flower could suddenly appear mysterious. The questioning continued for hours. Why do you collect plants at night? Because some herbs are easy to gather after the day's heat has passed. Why do wild animals not fear you? Because I do not harm them. Every answer sounded reasonable, yet reason was struggling against fear. As evening approached, an elderly woman entered the hall. Everyone recognized her. Years earlier, she had been desperately ill. Doctors had refused to travel so far. The healer from the stone cottage had cared for her for nearly a week. Slowly, she had recovered. The old woman stood before the gathering and spoke with a trembling voice. "This woman saved my life." The room became very quiet. I would not be standing here today if she had wished people harm. For the first time since the investigation had begun, doubt spread through the crowd. Several villagers lowered their heads. Others looked toward Hopkins, waiting for his response. He remained silent for a long moment. Then he simply replied, "Kindness does not always prove innocence." The words hung heavily in the air. The old woman had no answer. She quietly returned to her seat. The woman from the cottage looked around the hall. Some faces still showed compassion. Others showed only fear. She realized something painful. This trial was no longer about evidence. It had become a battle between 2 powerful forces: memory and fear. Outside, rain began to fall against the small windows. Inside, the candle flames flickered as the evening wind slipped beneath the old wooden door. No verdict had been reached, but everyone sensed that the final decision was drawing near. And whatever happened next, the village would never be the same again. The final hearing took place on a gray morning. A cold wind swept across the village square as people slowly gathered outside the meeting hall. No one spoke above a whisper. Inside, the room was crowded. Farmers stood beside merchants. Mothers held their children close. Even those who had once defended the woman now seemed uncertain. Matthew Hopkins opened his notebook one last time. Every accusation had been written down. Every rumor had been carefully collected. But when the time came to present real evidence, the room fell strangely quiet. There were stories. There were fears. There were suspicions. Yet there was almost nothing that could truly prove she had committed a crime. The woman stood calmly before the court. She looked tired, but not defeated. When she was asked if she wished to speak, she nodded. "I have never claimed to possess magic," she said softly. "I only learned what my mother taught me, and what her mother taught her before that. I cannot stop storms. I cannot control disease. I cannot change the harvest. I only tried to ease pain wherever I found it." No one interrupted her. For a brief moment, the room was completely silent. An elderly farmer slowly removed his cap. It was his wife the healer had cared for years earlier. Another woman quietly wiped tears from her eyes. She remembered the night her own child survived a terrible fever. One by one, memories began returning. Not memories of fear, but memories of kindness. History tells us that many women accused during the English witch trials were never fortunate enough to experience such a moment. Hundreds were imprisoned. Many were executed. Others died while waiting for trials that never came. Their names disappeared from history, leaving behind only faded court records and forgotten documents. Whether this particular woman walked free or not is something we may never know with certainty. The records from many small villages have been lost forever. Some were destroyed by time. Others simply vanished. But historians do know one thing. Most women accused of witchcraft were not powerful sorceresses. They were ordinary people. Midwives, healers, widows, mothers, women whose knowledge seemed mysterious in a world that lacked scientific understanding. Today, researchers studying surviving court documents have discovered that fear, not evidence, often shaped these trials. Communities living through war, disease, hunger, and uncertainty desperately searched for someone to blame. And far too often, that blame fell upon the most vulnerable. As the meeting ended, the villagers slowly stepped outside. The morning mist still covered the fields. Life continued. Children laughed again. Farmers returned to their work. The seasons changed just as they always had. But somewhere in the quiet English countryside, the memory of one woman lingered, not because she was a witch, but because history had mistaken wisdom for danger. Centuries later, visitors walked through peaceful villages filled with ancient cottages, old churches, and winding stone paths. Few realize that behind those beautiful landscapes are stories of people whose voices were almost erased. Perhaps that is why history matters. It reminds us that the loudest stories are not always the truest ones. Sometimes, the real story belongs to someone who never had the chance to tell it. And perhaps tonight, as you listen to the quiet sounds around you, you might remember the lonely woman at the edge of the village, a woman who gathered herbs, who comforted the sick, who frightened no one except those who feared what they did not understand. Her name may have been forgotten, but her story still whispers through the forests of England, waiting for someone to listen. The final hearing took place on a gray morning. A cold wind swept across the village square as people slowly gathered outside the meeting hall. No one spoke above a whisper. Inside, the room was crowded. Farmers stood beside merchants. Mothers held their children close. Even those who had once defended the woman now seemed uncertain. Matthew Hopkins opened his notebook one last time. Every accusation had been written down. Every rumor had been carefully collected. But when the time came to present real evidence, the room fell strangely quiet. There were stories. There were fears. There were suspicions. Yet there was almost nothing that could truly prove she had committed a crime. The woman stood calmly before the court. She looked tired, but not defeated. When she was asked if she wished to speak, she nodded. "I have never claimed to possess magic," she said softly. I only learned what my mother taught me, and what her mother taught her before that. I cannot stop storms. I cannot control disease. I cannot change the harvest. I only tried to ease pain wherever I found it. No one interrupted her. For a brief moment, the room was completely silent. An elderly farmer slowly removed his cap. It was his wife the healer had cared for years earlier. Another woman quietly wiped tears from her eyes. She remembered the night her own child survived a terrible fever. One by one, memories began returning. Not memories of fear, but memories of kindness. History tells us that many women accused during the English witch trials were never fortunate enough to experience such a moment. Hundreds were imprisoned. Many were executed. Others died while waiting for trials that never came. Their names disappeared from history, leaving behind only faded court records and forgotten documents. Whether this particular woman walked free or not is something we may never know with certainty. The records from many small villages have been lost forever. Some were destroyed by time. Others simply vanished. But historians do know one thing. Most women accused of witchcraft were not powerful sorceresses. They were ordinary people. Midwives, healers, widows, mothers, women whose knowledge seemed mysterious in a world that lacked scientific understanding. Today, researchers studying surviving court documents have discovered that fear, not evidence, often shaped these trials. Communities living through war, disease, hunger, and uncertainty desperately searched for someone to blame. And far too often, that blame fell upon the most vulnerable. As the meeting ended, the villagers slowly stepped outside. The morning mist still covered the fields. Life continued. Children laughed again. Farmers returned to their work. The seasons changed just as they always had. But somewhere in the quiet English countryside, the memory of one woman lingered, not because she was a witch, but because history had mistaken wisdom for danger. Centuries later, visitors walked through peaceful villages filled with ancient cottages, old churches, and winding stone paths. Few realize that behind those beautiful landscapes are stories of people whose voices were almost erased. Perhaps that is why history matters. It reminds us that the loudest stories are not always the truest ones. Sometimes, the real story belongs to someone who never had the chance to tell it. And perhaps tonight, as you listen to the quiet sounds around you, you might remember the lonely woman at the edge of the village, a woman who gathered herbs, who comforted the sick, who frightened no one except those who feared what they did not understand. Her name may have been forgotten, but her story still whispers through the forests of England, waiting for someone to listen.